welcome to the Wild Side. This is your host, Kight, and that was The Ducks with The Leather-Winged Bat. And on today's show, I'm going to talk about bats because there has been a recent study looking at the effects of ecology on mental capacity, and the authors of the study have used bats as their focal species. In fact, they've used 3 species of bat. And this is a really interesting study because it looks at how potentially the environment can affect whether or not certain species and certain individuals within a species start to have different cognitive abilities than others. So you've got different species that would have kind of different environments that they would live in. They would have different life history patterns and so interact with the environment differently. And this might put different evolutionary pressures on their brains and on their cognitive function. And then even within a species, you've got different individuals that might be a little bit more or less flexible, and that would make them better able to deal with the environment or not, depending on the case. And then that could potentially be some adaptations then that could be acted upon by evolution. So this is all interested in looking not just at bats, but using this information about bats to think about how other animals could, over time, develop the sort of cognitive capacities that we begin to see in really intelligent individuals. So I think a lot of the research here is thinking about what is it that drives particular species to become very intellectual and very able to kind of control their own environments. So things like dolphins, things like humans, things like apes that have quite a lot of mental capacity and can make instruments, they can change the world around them, they can interact with each other in quite complex ways. How is it that all of this arises in those species, and in other species we don't see anything at that sort of level of complexity? So just to give a bit of background into the study, basically we know that the cognitive abilities of lots of animals are well adapted to the requirements of the habitats in which they live, or their ecological niches. And that's why evolutionary researchers have begun to think that ecology could drive the evolution of both cognition and intelligence. So what are some of the examples of these things that we actually have seen out in the wild that suggest that this is the case? Well, for example, we know that in migratory bird species, you tend to have longer term memory and better long-term memory than in non-migratory species. Similarly, we know that in species that store food, these guys have better spatial memory than species that don't, and this is called caching behavior. And sometimes you also find that within these species, the reason that they have such good memory and such a good ability to navigate is that they actually have a larger portion of the brain that's devoted to these particular types of function. We also know in certain species of crab, if you've got more mobile individuals and more mobile species, these guys can show experience-dependent modifications of their foraging behavior. So basically, because they're out and about in the environment, they encounter certain conditions, they learn certain things, and so they begin to change the way they behave. On the other hand, more sedentary species don't show these sorts of adaptations, so they aren't responding to the environment and changing their behavior over the long term in quite the same way. Likewise, in lizards, we see that foraging lizards, so ones that have to actually go out and search around in order to find things, these guys tend to perform better at discrimination tasks than predators that have to sit and wait for their prey to just walk on by and then they kind of grab it as it goes. So these guys actually have to go out and look for things. For some reason, this allows them to develop a better ability to tell certain things apart from others when they're looking at the habitat. And of course that does kind of make sense if you think about it. These are guys that are going to have to use that sort of ability to find the food as they're foraging. And so they can kind of use that in lots of different contexts and not just in the context of eating. And another last example, in voles, we know that species that forage in less complex habitats have slower learning speeds and also decreased flexibility. So all of these things together suggest that you are going to have these kind of environmental effects on mental ability and the way that animals use their brains to engage with the world. Now, in general, we know that food often plays a really important role in this because searching through the environment to try to find food is a really fundamental task that a lot of animals do. And of course, it's also going to be kind of central to whether or not these things can survive, and so therefore play a really strong role in evolution. or potentially play a really strong role in evolution. And we do know that when food is more unpredictable, so when animals can't be sure of where to find it or when they're going to find it, they are more likely to engage in social foraging, so they kind of team up, working with family members or other kin, or kind of a close-knit group, or even a really large group that has hundreds and thousands of individuals. It really kind of depends on the species. But we do know that social foraging is much more common when these guys can kind of benefit from working together in order to find those scarce and unpredictable resources. Likewise, we know that dietary generalism is more common, because if you aren't as specifically focused on a particular thing, it's going to be to your advantage in a situation where food is unpredictable, because that means that you can take advantage of whatever happens to be available rather than a specific thing and only that thing that you have to repeatedly hunt for in the environment. And both of these are factors that we know shape the evolution of cognition. So the more the more social something is, whether in a foraging context or otherwise, the more cognitive capacity it's likely to have, and also the more generalist a diet is, the more likely that an animal is going to be quite cognitively advanced. Because again, when you are a generalist, you have to be able to kind of go with the flow, look for lots of different things, work with lots of different habitats, and of course all of that is going to require different bits of the brain to kind of piece all those factors together. And you can even generalize again from that to say that any kind of heterogeneity, whether it's spatial or temporal, of the environment is going to influence the rate of evolution of cognitive skills. So it's not just whether it has to do with food or socializing, but pretty much anything that is unpredictable in the environment and is going to be changing quite a lot is going to make you as an animal and you as a species have to work with those sorts of factors and figure out how best to deal with a kind of constant change and constant flux so that you can then survive and reproduce successfully in that area. So in the current paper, the authors have compared learning and flexibility in insectivorous bats, so obviously bats that are eating bugs and other inverts, to investigate the influence of the animal's ecological niche, and in particular the foraging habitat and degree of stereotypy in foraging behavior on their cognitive abilities. So they're looking at foraging habitat in terms of what's the environment in which these animals are going out to find their prey, and also degree of stereotypy means how often are they doing exactly the same thing over and over when they're out looking for prey, or how often do they have to kind of wing it, no pun intended, and kind of think on the fly. Again, no pun intended, they're just coming fast and heavy here. How else can I say this so I'm not sounding so ridiculous? Basically, they're having to think things up as they go while they're hunting, and that is not at all stereotypical, and that means that they're going to probably be a little bit more cognitively advanced. Now, bats are an interesting species, a group of species to look at, because they are the second most species-rich mammalian order, so there are lots of potential study organisms out there. And on top of that, there's a lot of ecological diversity, even among related species. So you have quite a lot of variation between closely related species, but also similarities between distantly related species. And this is particularly true when you're looking at characteristics like echolocation ability, and also how they use their echolocation capacity, things like wing morphology. So these are the two kind of key things that help them relate to the habitat in terms of foraging. So how they can fly around in it and how they can navigate through it. And those two things, you see quite a huge amount of variation when you're looking across all the bats. And we know that this kind of clear impact of ecology on general body plan suggests that the environment could also affect cognition. So likely it's not just echolocation and wings, but also mental capacity as well. Now, the diets of these animals can include lots of things. I said that these researchers focused on insectivorous species, but in fact bats also can eat nectar, pollen, fruit, small vertebrates, and even blood. So there's lots of variety out there, and they've just focused in on one little subset. Now, according to the authors, you can categorize insectivorous bats kind of loosely into three different functional groups, according to the complexity of the habitat in which they're foraging, the stability of the habitat over time, and also the sensory basis of the prey detection. So their three basic groups are bats that use echolocation to forage in the open, whether it's over air or over water, bats that use prey-emitted acoustic cues to glean from vegetation or open ground, and bats that use echolocation to hunt prey that are near vegetation. And they selected one representative species from each of these different categories, and all of those were from the same species, which is Myotis. So this means that these guys are kind of somewhat closely related, and therefore will have certain genealogical things in common, and taxonomically they are going to be kind of related, so you can rule out certain effects of genes to some extent, but also they're different enough from one another that you can make these sorts of comparisons that they're interested in. And the authors specifically investigated whether learning performance and behavioral flexibility vary depending on the foraging ecology of the species. And they hypothesized that species hunting in structurally complex habitats that fluctuate over time should learn faster because they have to deal with that wide variety and ever-changing nature of their environment. And they also should be more flexible than species that hunt in less complex, more stable habitats. And I'll talk a little bit more in a minute about what they mean by flexibility and why this should actually be relevant. Now, they also felt that the least demanding foraging should be found in the sorts of bats that are foraging over water, because in this case you've got echoes that are reflected from the insects as the bats are broadcasting their echoes. Those bounce back off the insects. They're not masked by echoes that are reflected from other surfaces around them. So for example, a bat that is hunting in the trees would have its echolocation signal bounced back off of leaves as well as potential prey, and so it would have to discriminate amongst all those things. But when you're out over the open, a grassy open area or the open water, the only thing that your signal is bouncing off of is prey or maybe other bats. There aren't lots of other structural things in the way. And so that makes it a bit easier for these guys to echolocate when they're foraging. The water also acts as an acoustic mirror, which reflects the sound energy away from the bats, which further helps this process. And on top of this, bodies of water tend to be fairly uniform and unstructured. They don't undergo large changes from night to night or over a bat's lifetime, unless you're talking about bats that live in highly drought-prone areas. So basically these guys kind of get to know a habitat, and then that's it. Once they've learned it, they're pretty comfortable. For the bulk of their lifetime, it's going to be more or less the same. They don't have to keep relearning new characteristics. And the flight activity of these guys is also generally consistent, regardless of insect densities over the water. So that means that when they go out to hunt, they do kind of the same sort of maneuvering over the water as they're hunting again and again. They don't change that depending on how many insects they are detecting in the environment. And this is what I was referring to earlier when I talked about stereotypy. So these guys have a lot of stereotypy in their flight activity, and this indicates that, again, the bats don't have to learn to alter their behavior in response to their prey. So that's the first group, the kind of simplest group of the three that they looked at. The second group are the bats that glean arthropods from open ground and from the vegetation. And in these guys, as I suggested earlier, the insect noises can often be masked by other things that are in the environment. So background-generated clutter noises, and also other sorts of sounds that might happen as the bats are echolocating. And bats have to specialize and listen for prey-generated sounds that stand out from all these other things that are in the background. And on top of this, the foraging habitats tend to be highly structured and undergo large changes over the course of the year. So as you have flowers that are emerging and going, leaves that are coming and going, other animals maybe that migrate into the area and kind of get in the way of the prey, whatever is happening, there are lots of changes that kind of happen seasonally depending on which specific habitat you're looking at. So these guys do have to deal with that variation. That means they have to kind of adapt over time and recognize specific landscape features. And one of the ones that the authors gave an example of is a meadow that's just been mown. So these guys have to recognize that they have come back to that same meadow. It just sounds different because a lot of the grass has been taken away, and the fact that the grass has been taken away is going to alter the availability and the accessibility of the insect prey. And so the bats have to learn to adapt to this sort of thing and recognize whether this means it's a good hunting territory or a bad hunting territory. whether they should spend time there or go somewhere else. And they also have to learn sensory cues that indicate the presence of good prey or help them discriminate between good prey and bad prey. So for example, they have to be able to know that if a prey noise is quite loud, that means it's probably a bit closer, which means that it's a more appealing target than something that's quite quiet and therefore far away. So they have to think of they have to find out little cues like this and use them to their advantage as they're hunting. And we know that associative learning should be fairly important in such species, or at least more important than in open water foragers. And in this case, associative learning is kind of saying, I hear this signal and that means that I'm likely to get good food, or I hear this and it's likely to be bad. So you kind of make these associations between things and use that to make further decisions in the future. Now, the final group were the clutter specialists, and these are the guys that have the most challenging task when they're out there foraging. And that's because their environment changes rapidly throughout the seasons, more rapidly even than the last guys, and the insect abundance is fluctuating in space and time along with that, and that all happens because the insects are tied so closely to the vegetation properties, and these are habitats in which the vegetation properties are being altered more rapidly than in the last suite. And so these guys have to learn cues indicating the presence of prey. So for example, they need to know that if their echolocation signals are bouncing off of something that sounds in a certain way, that means it's X type of plant or Y type of plant, which means that a certain type of insect will or will not be there, and therefore they should stay in this habitat or go away. So, of course, those are all different. I gave you a bunch of binary decisions there, so they would have to take into consideration each of those things and say, yes, okay, then this response, or no, okay, then this response. And there are lots and lots of those that they would have to make at any given time, which makes it quite complex. And they would need to update these sorts of decisions and associations over time as the habitat changes. So what might sound good at the beginning of the season because it's springtime and a bunch of insects are emerging might actually later on be bad because those insects are all dead, and so the bats have to know, okay, this is good in April, but it's not so good in June, and so I need to go respond differently. And of course that gets to the sort of mental capacity that we might associate with the things that we typically consider a bit more complex, so maybe monkeys or even dolphins or something like that. So that is quite a lot of thinking that these guys have to do as they're out there navigating the habitat looking for food. Now the three species of choice to represent each one of these groups were M. capucinii, M. myotis, and M. emarginatus. And the first one of these, M. capucinii, was predicted to have stereotyped behavior, slow learning, and low flexibility. So these are the ones that are foraging out over the water. Then they predicted that the other two, the M. myotis and the M. emarginatus, would learn more quickly and be more flexible because they're the ones that are in the more complex habitats. And of course M. emarginatus, which falls into that last category of the most complex habitat dweller, that's the one that potentially would learn the fastest and be the most flexible in different environmental setups. And in this case, the environmental setup was a plastic maze that the researchers created and manipulated, and the animals had to crawl through it in order to search for food, and the food was in different places and they had to learn where it was. And then the authors made it more complex by kind of changing where the food was and making the bats learn new rules in order to locate it, and then look at how quickly they were able to figure out, as they were exploring, as they were learning these rules, how to kind of locate their food and then apply those new rules to keep locating the food over time. So this was all looking at exploration, rule learning, reversal learning. So they first would learn one thing and then they would have to learn to do the opposite of that. And basically mental flexibility and kind of applying complex rules to the process of locating and getting food. And I'm going to stop now for a bit of a break, and then I'll come back and talk more specifically about the experimental setup and how the authors tested all of these different things. Welcome back to The Wild Side. This is your host, Caitlin Kight, and that was King, Creosote, and John Hopkins with Bats in the Attic. And on today's show, I am talking about some recent research looking into the effects of ecological conditions on mental capacity. And the authors of this study looked at 3 different species of bats to see how these guys, well, were affected basically by kind of changing the environment and giving them tasks to do to make the food foraging more complex. And they were thinking that bats that had different requirements out in the field would respond differently to these experimental manipulations in the lab. And just before the break, I promised to talk a little bit more about how this was actually experimentally tested. So that's where we are now. Now, all 3 species of bats that they studied were captured and experimented upon in Bulgaria, where there is a research station, the Tabachka Bat Research Station, that is located near caves in northeastern Bulgaria and also central Balkan mountains near Gabrovo. So the researchers were able to go to these regions, collect adult male bats from each of the 3 species in the wild, take them back to the research station, and then study them there over the long term. Now, once they were taken back to the station, the bats were housed in a screen tent or in a small holding cage, depending on the species and the species requirements. And they were given an individual specific within the species haircut on the back. And I thought this was a funny detail because I can just imagine these people snipping the fur of these poor little bats. But they did this so that they could tell each one of them apart and videotape each of the trials and look at how the different individuals performed under these different circumstances. Now, each of the bats was given 2 days to acclimate to its new home and to get a bunch of food and kind of, get ready to undergo these sorts of trials, because you have to make sure that they're healthy and well fed, but then you also have to give them a bit of deprivation of food so that they have some impetus to actually go through these trials that are associated with seeking out and eating food. So the bats would have all been fed so they were sated and then weaned off of food a little bit to make them hungry and then put in the experimental setup. So the setup involved plastic mazes that consisted of 4 plastic boxes that were connected to a large central chamber by plastic tubes. And this all sounds kind of weird because we know, of course, that bats fly rather than traditionally crawl, but actually it's comfortable for them to crawl, and they do crawl across surfaces in the wild. It's just that they don't tend to do it when they're foraging. But in this case, previous research has shown that actually you can measure a lot of things reliably by putting bats under these sorts of circumstances, and it's a much easier way to put them in a controlled environment and get a nice good video of what these guys are doing. So they created these kind of plastic mazes that were big enough for all 3 species to comfortably maneuver around in and turn around in, so it wasn't like they were hemmed in. They could quite easily and comfortably go from one place to another. So when they were doing this, they had insects, in this case mealworms, that were put out in order to make the different bits of the environment interesting to them. So wherever the bats started out, whichever square box they were placed in, that had no food, but then the other boxes did. And so they would go out through the tubes, kind of explore the central chamber, go through some of the sidearm tubes, and end up in a box that hopefully had food. And that depended, whether or not it had food depended on the type of setup, and I'll get more into that a little bit later. Now, the entrance to each box could be closed with a plastic slide, and this is one of the things that the researchers used to help teach the bats which places were good and which places were bad. Because if they went to the wrong place, then you could kind of punish them by closing off the place that had food, and they would learn that that was a bad decision and that they shouldn't do it in the future. And the other thing that's interesting about this setup is that the researchers could add additional tubes and additional boxes in order to make the maze even more complex. So that meant that after the bats learned the kind of basic plan, you could then make it a little bit more complicated and see if they could apply those basic rules to an even more complex situation. Now, the experiments were recorded in near total darkness, but they did have one little kind of red light, which is not too stressful for eyes when you're out in the dark, and you probably will know this if you've ever gone out stargazing, because often they'll recommend, if you want to be able to look at a book that tells you what constellations are what, you take a flashlight and cover it with some sort of a red fabric or a red lens cover, so that way you can use the light to actually look at your book, but it won't hurt your eyes, so that when you look back at the stars you don't see anything at all. And bats, which of course are mammals just like us, they function similarly, and so this is quite comfortable for them and not kind of a harsh and artificial environment. Now, as I said, they recorded these experiments so that they could look back at them later and really analyze what the bats were doing as they were exploring. Now there were several different phases of the experiment, and each one kind of got more and more complicated in order to test all the different things that the bats could or could not do kind of mentally as they were out there foraging. So the first one was simply to look at basic exploration behaviors. So on the first night, the bats were placed into the maze, and they were allowed to explore freely and eat as many mealworms as they could find. And 3 mealworms were placed per box to kind of just give them an idea of, the fact that there would be food in there and that there could be food in any of the different arms of the setup. So this allowed for acclimation to the maze and also allowed the researchers to kind of investigate what sorts of things the bats were likely to do in order to figure out exactly how to set up the future trials that I'll describe here in a minute. And the different behaviors that they noticed included small-scale exploration, which is when the bats were kind of systematically moving back and forth within an arm or within a box. Also fast walking, where they were crawling straight through the maze, so they clearly had a destination in mind and they weren't stopping to look around as they went there. Or immobile, when they weren't moving at all. The researchers also quantified the number of boxes visited, so whether a bat kind of just went to the next door arm of the chamber or whether it went to all 3, for example. Also the number of mealworms eaten and the latency to exit the start box. So kind of how eager were these guys to get out there and explore, or how hesitant were they to move from where they were. They also looked at whether the bats explored the center box thoroughly. So did they go into that chamber and kind of look around it like it was any of the other boxes that had food, or did they just cross it in order to crawl from one arm to another? So all of this was just to get an idea of how the bats were responding to their habitat and interacting with their environment. So then the bats were put through a phase of training, and basically they were trained to find rewards in one of the boxes. And to do this, the researchers blocked the other arms with sliders so that only one box could be accessed. So you would start a bat off in a box, and it would basically only have one option to go. It could go into the tube from that box into the central chamber, and then only one of the other arms could be accessed, and at the end of that arm was a box that had food. And they repeated this multiple times, and basically the bats could have one single searching event where they could figure this out, that there was only one place to go. Then that would be followed by 9 more trials of exactly the same setup, over which hopefully the bat would learn quickly that there was only one place to go, that was the place it would always go, and it wouldn't even approach the other arms. And so the researchers looked at this in order to see how often did they learn this and how quickly could they learn this. And they repeated the trials multiple times after the bats got to the destination, ate a few mealworms, kind of got a brief rest, and then they would go through it all over again. And the next thing, experiments 2 through 4, is what kind of makes all this interesting, because once the bats have learned this basic rule, whether it's, you can eat from the tube across from where you are, or you can eat from the tube that's to the right of where you are, whatever the rule is, they then changed it up to see how quickly the bats could respond to this change in circumstances. Now in this case, the bats were tested in each of the following experimental setups for at least 3 sessions, and they had 1 session per night. And within each session, the arms of the maze were interchanged at kind of pre-decided times, and the center box was rotated, and all of this was to prevent the bat from following its own scent. So they had to make sure that the bat wasn't just kind of cheating by knowing where it had gone before, but it was actually showing again and again that it knew these rules and it knew how to respond to this specific environment. And for each of the new different setups, if the bats made 8 out of 10 correct decisions to get to the right place where the food was, they were classified as having learned that task, and they had to do this on 2 consecutive nights before the researchers were satisfied that it wasn't just by chance, and then they could move on to the next experiment. So what were these follow-up experiments that kind of got more complex relative to that initial learning period? Well, in experiment 2, all 4 arms of the maze were open. Food was found in the target box that the bat had previously been trained on, and if the bat entered an unrewarded arm, so not the rule that it had learned, the entrance to that box was blocked with a plastic slide, and the bat didn't get any food before it had to start the next trial. So basically in that very, very first setup, it could only have accessed, let's say, the box straight across from where it started out. And it could only do that because the slides were down on the other doors, and that was the only place it physically was able to go. In this next experiment, all those sliders were removed, so the bat actually could go to all the other arms, but still the food was only in the opposite one. And so they wanted to see, was it actually going there to get that food, or was it still exploring the other arms, even though it had been trained to avoid those? And in fact, it got punished if it did look at those other arms, and they wanted to see how quickly these bats responded to that punishment and learned that, again, they should still only be going to that one place. Now, in experiment 3, it's a bit more complex. So they performed a reversal experiment in which the box opposite the formerly rewarded box was now the one with food. So, of course, the bats are going to start off entering the formerly rewarded arm in most cases, but if they did that, they were denied access to the food. And so they had to learn to explore the other places, to explore the right place, and then to start going there again and again to get that food. So they're having to learn a brand new rule in this case. And the researchers measured the number of trials that were required for a bat to investigate the new arm. And then they looked at the number of days it took the animal from the first correct visit until it then could make 8 out of 10 correct trials in a single session. Now, the final experiment was even harder. It's actually a little bit mean if you think about it from the poor bat's perspective. So the researchers added 2 additional arms to the maze. So at the beginning I said they could make it more complex. Well, here's where they do that. So once the bat entered the previously rewarded box, it then could go through additional arms and enter a second decision box where it had to turn in the opposite direction as before to obtain the reward. Now, I have to say that when I read this, I thought, I don't even know that I could learn this very quickly in order to find my own food. So I did feel really sorry for the poor bats. So again, the researchers were measuring the number of trials required for the bats to figure out that they needed to investigate new space, and then to figure out exactly where they needed to go within that new space in order to find the food that they were after. And again, they were looking for an 8 out of 10 correct trial kind of benchmark to indicate that the bats really had learned the new information. So now I'm going to stop for a break again, and then after that I will tell you the results of all of this, and we can see which species performed the best under all these circumstances. Welcome back to the Wild Side. This is your host, Kight, and that was Bat for Lashes with I'm on Fire. Just before the break, I was talking about the experimental setup that a group of researchers used to look at how different bats responded to environmental changes, and in order to see how those changes kind of influenced their ability to learn rules and apply them when foraging for food. And all of this was designed to look at how environment affects cognitive ability. So what are the results of all these different experimental setups and the 3 different bat species that were put through them? Well, for experiment 1, which was the exploration experiment, the researchers found that for most of the behavioral parameters that they measured, there were no differences between the species. So latency to exit the start box, time spent with small-scale exploration, time spent fast walking, and time spent immobile were pretty much the same for all 3 species. And again, the species had different kind of foraging ecology, and so you would expect to maybe see some fundamental differences in how they interact with the environment. But in this case, on this very basic experiment, that wasn't observed. They found that on average, most of the bats left the start box within a minute. They spent about 10 minutes on small-scale exploration behaviors. They spent about 2 minutes walking fast and kind of going directly to a destination, and they spent about 3 minutes just sitting immobile somewhere within the maze. 3 of the kind of simplest species, 4 of the moderate species, and 5 of the most complex species in terms of ecology behaviors and foraging behaviors visited all of the 3 boxes. There was no difference in number of boxes visited among species, and the only difference that they observed was the number of mealworms consumed. And they found that M. myotis ate the most, M. capuccinii ate the least, and once you took body size into account, because some of the species were bigger than others, they found this was slightly different. Actually, it was M. emarginatus that ate the most and M. capuccinii that ate the least. So that's kind of interesting that one species would eat a bit more than another, regardless of kind of body size being taken into consideration, but not necessarily something that really directly answers the question of this study. So in experiment 2, the researchers were looking at simple rule learning, and all the species did learn the task pretty quickly. After 2 days, there were no species differences in the ability to make 8 out of 10 correct decisions. And so they were then able to proceed to experiment 3, which is really where this starts to get more interesting. And that's where they were looking at flexibility and the ability to relearn rules to apply them to the foraging situation. Now, most of the M. capuccinii needed several days to visit a new arm for the first time. And the other species usually visited a new arm on the first day. So these guys that tended to have a very simple foraging habitat and kind of stereotypical foraging behaviors where they're doing the same thing over and over again and they're always successful, they tended to need more time to do something different when they are put in this situation where suddenly the habitat has changed. And there was actually one of these guys, one M. capuccinii, that needed 78 trials before it was willing to try a different arm. Now obviously this is a bit of an outlier, which can really skew your significance of the statistical results, but even when that guy was removed from the trial, they still found that there was a significant effect of this particular species. So it really did act differently than the other ones in terms of exploring the environment. And it is really interesting to see that at least one individual was just so set in its ways that time and time again it simply would not go to another place. So there must be some, of course, going to be variation within a species, and on the extreme of that variation within some species, there are going to be animals that are really going to suffer if the environment changes and they just aren't really prepared to deal with that by kind of responding and changing their own behavior. So relearning speed didn't really vary from one species to another when you included this particular outlier. So all of them kind of needed, 6 days or so to achieve 8 out of 10 correct trials when they had to figure things out. Figure out how to change their behavior from before in order to now get the reward in the new location. And once they actually removed this kind of crazy outlier who wasn't able to learn very fast, M. capuccinii displayed significantly faster relearning speeds than the other species. And this is quite an unusual result because again, here this is the species that has the really simple habitat. You think it wouldn't relearn very well because it does display this stereotypical behavior. Here we found that it took more trials than the other two species to learn this new behavior, but then in a situation where it's relearning and not just learning, it suddenly does really well. So this is quite an unexplained result, but again, shows that you can have quite a lot of species variation. Now experiment 4 was when they looked at complex learning. This is where they added on the extra arms and the extra boxes, and the animals had to do quite a lot of twists and turns to get to the food. We're kind of back to the beginning now because that same simple species, M. capuccinii, took longer to learn the complex task than either of the two other species, but the results weren't highly significant, so they were kind of only borderline significant, and there were some outliers in the other groups that might have kind of influenced this. So again, this highlights the fact that there is quite a lot of variation within the different species as well as among them. So what does all of this mean? Well, the results strongly suggest that bat cognitive skills reflect the animal's ecological niche. So bats that typically hunt in more complex and less stable habitats that have lower food predictability are the ones that are more flexible and also better in learning more complex tasks. Bats that typically hunt in simpler, more stable habitats with highly predictable food resources tend to be less flexible and slower to learn tasks. So let's think about learning in an artificial environment. Now the researchers purposely chose experimental tasks that were foreign to all of the species because they wanted to make it easier to compare them. They didn't want to give one an unfair advantage over the others. So it's true that this is a bit of an artificial setup, but hopefully that kind of gives them an even playing field, basically, all these 3 different species of bats, so that you can then apply some really basic rules to think about the cognitive ability of these animals and to really isolate those things and not play to other strengths artificially. And indeed, the maze did seem to elucidate kind of consistent species differences in learning performance, which suggests that both in this study and in future studies, artificial setups can be used to balance potentially biasing factors to look at cognitive abilities in different types of species that you kind of want to compare. Now, in terms of solving the simple and the complex tasks, the researchers found that no species needed more than 2 days, which indicates that simple rules are fairly easy to learn, regardless of species-specific cognitive variations. This suggests that more complex tasks are really needed to differentiate between the mental capacities of these different species. And that was something that they began to see when they looked at situations where the bats needed to turn twice to get food. And you would think that maybe if they kept adding different turns or other sorts of variables to challenge the bats, that you would discriminate even better among the different species to figure out how the kind of cognitive abilities are influenced by the environment and what sorts of differences you have from one sort of species to another. They found that most M. myotis individuals met the learning criterion on the very first day of testing. They found that M. emarginatus needed only 1 to 2 days, and nearly half of M. capuccinii required almost a week. And this was more or less the kind of spread of learning that they expected. Maybe not in terms of exactly the number of days, but where each of those species would be located. So M. myotis was the one that was hunting in the most difficult situations. M. emarginatus was the one that was in the most difficult situations. M. myotis was the one that was kind of a passive listener, hunting in the open environments, listening for the sounds of its prey so that it could cue in on them. And then you've got M. capuccinii, which is the open water forager. So more or less this is kind of what they expected, where you had the simplest animals that were taking the longest and the more complex animals taking a bit less time in order to figure out the rules. Now it is kind of interesting that M. myotis and M. emarginatus were situated where they were, because you might think that emarginatus, as the one that is in the most complex environment, would be the fastest learner because it would have the most flexibility, but that wasn't the case. However, there wasn't a huge difference between it and myotis, so maybe again you just needed to have a more complex study in order to really discriminate between those different types of individuals. Now they didn't find any kind of intermediate learning performance in M. capuccinii, so what I mean by that is that the animals either learned within 1 to 2 days, or you had a group that could learn within 6 to 7 days, but you didn't have any that were there in that 3 to 5 day period. So either you had great learners or really terrible learners and nothing in the middle, which is kind of interesting, that within a species you have variation, but it's variation where you've either got one extreme or the other and nothing in the middle. And you kind of have to wonder if there's some sort of evolutionary reason for that, whether it has to do with brain structure or how they learn, or some sort of selection on something else that happens to have this side effect. Who knows? And I mentioned earlier that individual that needed 78 trials to investigate the new arm. And what was quite interesting was that in one of the tasks that it had to learn, it actually was the fastest learner. So that suggests that even though certain individuals can be really inflexible in some situations, they also are capable of learning complex tasks and doing it quite quickly in other situations. So just because you perform in a certain way in one area doesn't mean you're always going to show that sort of phenotype, if you like, that sort of behavior in all areas, which is, again, a really important lesson to take in terms of cognitive function and also in terms of just behavior in general. And the patterns in M. capuccinii suggest that while these animals can learn simple rules, it just takes them longer to do so, and the animals have trouble remembering them, which is exactly what you would expect for animals like this that are foraging in the least complex areas, because these are just not animals that necessarily would need to be built to have this kind of behavior. Now in the final experiment, a few individuals of each species went straight through the center of the box several times, despite never having received a ward at the box end of that arm. So why is it that these bats seemingly were just determined to get to that place, even though there was no reason for them to get there? There seemingly should be no food, and yet they really seemed to march straight to that location. And they rarely saw that behavior in any of the other experiments, which makes them wonder why it developed here. So they wondered if the bats were perhaps making some sort of a cognitive map of the maze that prompted them to try to find shortcuts or use more direct routes that their brains were suggesting to them, even if it wasn't actually physically possible given that particular maze setup. And they suggest that maybe they should do some further experiments to use setups that are a bit more flexible and allow them to see whether the bats are maybe making these mental maps that allow them to navigate as efficiently as possible and not have to worry about these kind of tubular and box-shaped constraints. Because of course if you're a bat flying around in the air, you can make those sorts of shortcuts if you like. Now, in terms of flexibility and relearning, the results support what the researchers refer to as the environmental complexity thesis, which is something that predicts that bats or any animals that hunt in more complex and unpredictable habitats should have more flexible behavior. And that's because this sort of capability should help individuals enhance the probability that they will find food in that area. And again, just to talk about M. capuccinii, this is an animal that specializes on a very specific type of food in a quite simple foraging habitat, and that's why this sort of animal should have more obstinacy and more persistence, because it's unlikely to run across something else that it's going to substitute in its diet. It really is only going to eat that one thing in that one place. And of course that could be quite evolutionarily useful in some situations, because it means that the animals are going to feel less inclined to sample new areas that haven't been proven. So they're not going to waste their time in places that they don't know for certain are going to be nice. But at the same time, this could be bad, because if things do change and you are not showing any inclination to kind of roll with the punches and explore other options, then you're going to kind of be stuck. And this, of course, is something that could be quite important when you think about climate change, anthropogenic effects on the habitat, other things that can really quickly alter an environment and require animals to respond quickly to those changes. Now, the authors point out that previous studies have related brain size with hunting strategies in other species of mammals and also in birds, and they suggest that this could be investigated in the future with morphological research in the bat species that they've studied here. But for now, they have to just kind of rely on skull measurements, and these do suggest that M. capuccinii does have the smallest relative brain of all the tested species, which you'd expect given the habitat in which it hunts and the way in which it hunts. So as predicted, the open water foragers were the most stereotyped and less flexible than species hunting in complex habitats, but contrary to the author's expectations, the open water foragers could learn simple rules relatively quickly, although they did have trouble with some of the more complex rules. And the other species were more alike than they expected, but again, they think that perhaps a more complex task and a more complex setup could help to discriminate against these, and they might do that in the future. And overall, the data here support the hypothesis that the cognitive abilities of animals are indeed shaped, at least partly, by the demands of their ecological background. And this suggests that environment can strongly influence not just morphological features, but also intelligence, and therefore promote the evolution of cognitive abilities. So that is something for you to keep in mind the next time you wonder, why is it that we humans can be so very clever and do all these sorts of things that we don't necessarily see in other species? And one potential answer, one reason that we have things like computers and really complex architecture and music and all these other amazing things that we create, is that we've had very complex environments, we've had very difficult tasks to achieve in order to survive and do things like foraging for food, reproducing, working together as a society, and all of that could have driven us to have the brains that we have today.